Again, good morning to those who are coming back from yesterday, those who are here today, and those who are watching online live around the world. So we are going to talk now about the modern era border security. It's somewhat a blurred concept, and we'll start by introducing our members, and then we'll ask some basic questions maybe that we should ask, like what is a border these days? So first, Eran, Bluestein, a couple words about yourself and your company.
My name is Eran Bluestein. I'm the Director of Business Development for Opgal Electronic Industries. We're a company in the north of Israel. We've been dealing with thermal imaging for security, iHLS defense for nearly 40 years now. A very wide portfolio in all the security, both short range, long range. And I think we've experienced different types of border projects all around the world for a few decades now.
Right. David Tsur, I should say Major General, formerly from Israeli Police and Border Control. A couple words about your background.
I grew up at the counter-terrorist unit, Yamam. I commanded that unit for 4 years, and then on the ranks in the police, one of my general positions was the general for the border guard police. My last position, the chief of police of Tel Aviv district. I ran also to the parliament. I was a parliament member for 2 years. And between that and I am running my company as a consulting company for large sport events and border security and counterterrorism for governments.
And thank you for coming this morning. Sharon?
Yes, I work in Magal. I'm the chief architect. Personally, I've been in the field for more than 30 years, designing and consulting for iHLS. Magal itself has been working since 1969, protecting borders all around the world, specifically in Israel. 90% of the borders are protected by Magal's technologies.
Right. Magal, one of the oldest in the business here in Israel. Right. And Noam Donenfeld from Elta Iai.
Hi, my name is Noam Donenfeld. I've been in Elta for the last 15 years, doing iHLS business development. We did numerous projects for land borders and coastal surveillance, as well as perimeter protection. And actually, all our radars are in the borders of Israel, both the coastal radars and the ground surveillance radars.
And last but not least, Avi Yariv, actually the conference chairman, iHLS, of course. Avi?
When I was in the military about 20 years ago, 2000, 2001, I was part of the Israeli drawback from Lebanon and building the first smart border on the Israel borders with Lebanon, which was later copied or pasted around the world, around Israel with Syria, Egypt, and so on. So I've been in the business of border protection for the last 20 years around the world, consulting and making mega projects around the world.
Okay. So, as I said, let's start with some basics. What is a border, actually, these days, when we say a border? Eran, let's start with you.
A national border basically is any differentiation between the political government of one country to another. It's very simple. You see it on maps. And obviously some countries have more challenging borders. Israel actually has except for maybe the Palestinian territories,
Yeah.
Their external borders are pretty well defined.
Yeah.
It gets a bit more complex internally. But today, obviously, passing those borders becomes a lot more amorphic when it comes to how somebody actually passes those borders. It could be by cyber, like your previous panel, or it could be physically, or it could be by shipping any type of substance or item that could be harmful and needs to be detected when transferring those borders.
So, David, is there a border between two countries and governments here, as he mentioned?
Yes, Eran mentioned, maybe because we're trying to duplicate maybe the situation and the solutions in Israel to other places. But let's face it, Israel is a complicated border situation, and we divide it to hostile borders with enemies and open borders with like a peace border. Maybe I'll give just an example from my career. Actually, I was appointed as the general for the border guard police, and the prime minister at that time, Ariel Sharon, decided that we will take over the responsibility for the west border with Egypt. At that time, there was no fence. So we tried to look for the solutions that we need, because without fence, it's kind of a peace. Also, we have the peace agreement with Egypt, and all the agreements not to use excessive force in coming the smuggler from there, the human trafficking, the drug trafficking, whatever, a lot of things. So we set with also, besides of using the intelligence or the obvious technology which we use there, we try to sit with the tribes to understand the mechanism. And the head of the tribe, actually, one of the meetings with the coffee, said, look, the British were here, the Turk was here, the Arabs were here, and you are here now, and we have family on the other side. So who's the one there to decide that we can't cross, because we're crossing for hundreds of years. So for them, a border that we're putting, it's not something which is obvious. So to obey to this kind of a border makes it much more complicated. And if we take it to Africa, there is no fence in Africa. There is resistance to that. All the presidents are against it. So it's making it much more challenging how to create security in the border, but on the other hand, to let the border to breathe, to that the people can live there.
Okay, so let's take that, Noam. And how do you make a non-border border with technology?
So ever since the time where borders were borders, there were no fences, and people can go from one country to another or one area to another. And as David mentioned, with both sides of the borders, most of the times are similar tribes which have connections, either commercial connections and even family connections with each other, and you have to actually implement the right solution for the right problem. So the first thing you have to do is actually to define what kind of situation you go into a specific border which you want to implement some solution. And based on that definition, you can build up ConOps for such a solution and come up with the right implementation for a border solution, whether it's fence-wise, physical border, whether it's electronic border, or it's surveillance of other kinds, and also implement some sophisticated add-ons to monitor this border.
So let's talk sophisticated. Sharon, give me some examples of technologies that control borders like that.
So there are two types of risks that you have to handle. There's the high risk, where you need some kind of sensors or barrier, whether it's man-made or physical. But in terms of sensors, let's take soft borders, the ones without fences, where the risk is relatively low. And usually these borders have crossings that are known. They're border crossings. They're the roads where people travel. Now, next to them, there are forests, and in the forest, nobody's supposed to travel. Also, not all sensors are available and can work in such environments. So let's take an example of a system that works over cellular detection. So if we take into consideration or assumption that people that migrate illegally, they're not a threat. They have cell phones. They want to communicate with their family, between each other. And if we detect random cellular phones coming together and then walking across certain areas, that warrants some kind of investigation. This is one way. First is for a forest. Let's say we have a different scenario where we have waterways. So there are fishermen. Usually this fisherman, he goes out with a crew of 3 to do his business, and he goes out for 3 days. More than that, the fish will be spoiled. Now, using intelligence, you detect that he's buying food for 2 weeks and enough to feed 20 people. Now you need to go and investigate. And that's using different thoughts and different sensors than what we usually do.
So it's much more than what we might think is just a fence, and how do we keep the fence with cameras and stuff like that. It's a whole envelope of intelligence, actually.
Exactly. Fences, as well as natural phenomena like mountains or gorges or whatever, are used in high-risk areas where you need to stop something from happening. Like it was explained before, there's a terror problem, you need to create a barrier. But in Europe, they won't put up fences, mostly, except maybe in the exterior areas where they have problems. So we need to think out of the box.
Okay, Eran, talk to me more about some technologies that you can talk about.
We focus more on the surveillance aspect of it. That's what we know how to do. But I definitely agree with Sharon that today the solution requires a lot more capabilities, both on the technological level and on the training of the operators, the officers, and even the decision makers on how to actually talk about those borders. Let's assume that the government wants to know when someone is crossing that border, or to stop him in general and then decide if he should or should not cross that border. So there's many ways to do that. If we're talking today, and I'm thinking a lot about the southern border that you mentioned before, Tsur, because as a reserve soldier, I've been serving there for 20 years. So I remember how it was 10 years ago and before that every single footprint on the border, the whole unit would be out on the sector looking for whoever it was. Most of the time it was illegal immigrants. But we had to address the potential that it could be either terrorists, or one of the things that happens there a lot, drug dealers. Because of the problems you also described regarding the Bedouin tribes, which were split in half when the border was there. Then suddenly the fences came up and the surveillance went better. And today the soldiers there are more like quick response teams, which are basically sent to the location where there is some type of, or even before that person crosses the border or even reaches the border, we already know that he's going to be there, and we can make sure that somebody is there to intercept them. And that changes the whole way that whole sector is managed. Right. And that's allowed with technology.
Actually, just to continue from that, maybe just to assume it, that we have to look at it as main four pillars which create a good border. One is what you said just now. I mean, all the surveillance, the intelligence array, to intercept and to prevent from coming to the border, or once they come, so we can act against them. The second one is the physical barrier. It can be fence, where it can be, or it can be other kind of barriers, sensors, etc., to deter. And the third one is the reacting units, because it's one of the chief in South Africa told me once, we tried to tell her about camera, sensors, etc., and she said, okay, but I never saw a camera which caught a thief, and she's right. I mean, we have to have very good troopers on the ground, very well trained, and to act quickly in real time. And the fourth pillar is the command control, because all of these sensors and troopers and everything have to be very well controlled by one commanding control center, and because borders are also with a lot of civilian units, like customs, like immigration, police, etc. It's not only, especially on the places which there is So those 4 pillars have to be strong, and each one of them can't be only the good one. I mean, as we know, the strength of a chain is looking for the weak one.
Avi, here in Israel, we have a very delicate situation with borders, and we are also confronting all kinds of risks, whether it's smugglers in the south, and maybe terrorists, and maybe migrant workers, the whole thing. So it was just natural for this kind of industry to grow up here in Israel?
First of all, the answer is yes, because there is a need, there is innovation. You combine those two and you have a solution. But when we're looking outside of Israel, from my experience, there almost are no 2 borders which are alike. Terrain, risk, threats, requirements of the border, and so on. So the way of handling borders, by the way, in Israel and mostly around the world, is by building having some kind of technology building blocks. So you have the capabilities, and I'm sure we can tell you more. You have the concept of how to protect this kind of a border and what is required from the border, and then you tailor your building blocks to that. Remember, it's a holistic solution. Because what you take, you have a border and your mission is to close it, and then you know that everybody is coming from the other side. So it's something which is more holistic than looking at a specific, well-defined problem, but you have to look at it in a national point of view. Some countries, most of their economy is built on drug trafficking. So they tell you they want border protection, but it will kill their economy, and they know it. So it's a very delicate matter.
Right, so how do you approach it, Noam? I'm going to ask you, how do you, make this suit to suit the border?
As I mentioned, to actually suit up each border according to its requirements and needs, and no 2 borders are alike in Israel, and especially around the world. If you travel around the world, in South America or in Europe, in the outskirts of Europe, no borders are the same. And actually the reconnaissance and the surveillance equipment is not the same because the terrain and the vegetation, for example, is different. So some areas are obscured by vegetation or mountains or other obstacles, and some areas are very, very open, and you can actually monitor them with few surveillance equipment. I would also like to address the use of autonomous measures like other vehicles, RGVs, and drones to monitor this area. This can actually enhance the solution greatly and reduce a lot of manpower, both in the reconnaissance and intelligence aspect, and even in the interception point all the way. Of course, interception has to have a man in the loop. You don't want to shoot anybody autonomously.
Right. Right. We'll talk about that. Yes, David.
Jacob, maybe I just wanted to raise one point. We had this dilemma a lot here in Israel, but it's not only here. I mean, it's something which we have a lot of experience. And it's maybe connected to the last session you had here. There is a conflict between the privacy and the need to control and to have it. So we have to look how we create the incentive to make a good checkpoints, which, yeah, you have to put your details inside and you have to be in the whitelist. But somebody who doesn't have to hide nothing, and he would just want to cross the border because he needs to work in the other side. So it's a huge incentive, and it's economy. I mean, it's by encouraging that, we can create borders which are really efficient, and not only. So we saw it in the borders with the Palestinians. We saw it in other borders that even with Egypt. That once you have the biometric passport or biometric IDs, you can cross. So there's a lot of companies here in Israel and outside which actually are very active on that. Once you do that, you can kind of eliminate like 80% of the problem, because most of them will go by those checkpoints, and then you have to deal with the bad guys but the whitelist can be
Right. Sharon, these are huge projects. You're not a, a software company. You go to borders where you have sometimes hundreds of kilometers, and you need to provide a solution. How do you go about this kind of projects? Give us some perspective on that.
So first of all, after contacting the customer, you have to do a site visit and a risk assessment. You have to understand the customer's pain points. You have to understand what he perceives as his problems. Then you have to make a study and to understand what is really going on. This takes time. It's with this information, you understand things that sometimes the customer himself doesn't understand. Once you've done that, you survey his terrain to understand how difficult it will be to implement. I'll give you an example. Some countries have high mountain areas, very difficult to overcome. Now, instead of installing sensors all over the place, which will be very costly for implementation, as well as later on for maintenance, you can understand where the necessary passageways are and do the detection along these necessary passageways. And then use systems like rovers or drones or UAVs or tactical balloons to patrol the other areas, because at the end of the day, it takes time to cross this mountain area. And patrols can detect people more than one. If it's one, it's low profile. It's different tactics. I said everything depends on risks. But if it's more than one, then it's easy to detect them along the way. Otherwise, they'll come to a necessary passage where you will deal with them. And of course, the reaction team needs to be as mobile as the solution. So if you have a vast area of mountains, you need the reaction team to be mobile just as your sensors, some kind of airborne reaction team or something like that.
Mm-hmm. But by the way, do you work with local contractors to do work on the ground?
Well, Magal usually use local, it's called local content. We divide the work between what we do, the integration, and supplying the sensors, and we use local content to do the physical installations.
All right.
I think that it really depends often where you actually approach the project, okay? If we're lucky enough to approach at the conceptual stage where we can really get there with the stage where they're actually planning what they want to do, you discover very interesting things. First of all, many of the countries don't really know what they want, okay? You come to a place where they're trying...
They want people to keep out.
Oh, yeah, they know that part, but they won't, they might be telling you about things that they saw in other places, and they'll decide that they have to have this type of camera, or this type of optic, or this type of solution, which, as basically Sharon said, is not always the right solution for their location. It doesn't always meet their budget as well. Okay, and because we're talking about very high-profile projects, which are also very, very expensive, many of them want to see. They want to see the system before it works, and they usually don't want to invest in it before that happens, which is always sometimes a bit of a challenge, because as we can see, there are so many border projects that are going up in Eastern Europe, in Korea, in other places, in Africa, and everybody wants very, very advanced technology. The ability of a manufacturer to be there the next day, especially in Corona era, but and basically demonstrate a unit which the manufacturer may have only a handful of these units that are running around the world and demoing to customers isn't always very easy. One of the things I'm seeing now in tenders is that they're starting to say, we don't actually have to see the camera, but we want you to send us the videos. We want you to send us the specs. Obviously, the specs are always part of it, but we'll give a prize winner based on the videos that we can see there. And then you have the whole ecosystem of companies like ourselves, like Elta and with Magal, that are trying to team up for these tenders together in order to provide a full solution.
Yeah, so how do you integrate with each other? I'm curious.
We have actually a project together with Opgal, somewhere in the world, which I'm not going to disclose here, but we work together. So we, as an integrated system, we go with different sensors and make and produce a complete project together with different vendors. Either it's in-house or outside II, and of course we use local contractors for the infrastructure.
So, and these are very sophisticated technologies. What about training people on the ground there at the borders?
Beg your pardon?
I'm talking about training the staff on the borders.
Of course, part of the implementation phase is training, and sometimes there's mentoring, even for the first stage, in the command control center, especially for actually using the system, because you have to understand these. You come into a virgin country with any other than a command car patrol, and then you come in with all this technology. Part of the training is very important. If you don't train, nobody will use the system correctly,
right,
and they'll just render it useless.
David, I know you're going to tell me there's no 100% sealed border, but are we getting closer?
In our borders? Or,
Let's start with that, yeah.
Let's say it's a matter of, I'll come to that, but just to accomplish something, because today the challenge is that most of the countries want not a specific technology, they want a solution. They want some integrated solution which can bring everything, the intelligence, the sensors, the training, troopers, etc. So it comes to your question. If we can do by the budget, which is, because there's always limit budget, and the challenge is how to create a good solution from a budget which is given to this kind of a project, and not the opposite. I mean, because you can put layers of technology, and you come to the client, to the government here, and you say, okay, this is what we need to do. I think in our borders, the main challenge is the first one, and it's a political issue, create them. Actually, from 48, we don't have any borders. So we're still struggling for our borders. So once we know the borders, we can put the layers, because we have all the professional people, the security people, and also the technology companies to create a secure borders. I can say that the border with Jordan, let's say, it's a very good border. Although, I must say, some of the criminals that we see now, the weapons in the Arab society in the country is coming from that border. And, but we have a very good cooperation from the other side, because the Jordanians are very good military, very disciplined, and we have a very good cooperation. With the Egyptian, the cooperation also is improving very dramatically, because they have incentive to protect their border from the other side. And once the two sides have the same incentive and they're cooperating, so we can reach to a good point. Fortunately, we don't have it in the other borders, but they are quiet because there is a deterrence. If we're getting out from Israel and looking on the other places, mainly there are no good cooperation, not because they are hostile to each other, because they don't have any system for that. They want their borders to be open. So human trafficking is a huge issue. We're seeing what's happening now in the east border with Belarus, with Poland, and so they're using even some kind for political, international political meanings for the illegal immigrants or the refugees, how do you call them? So this is a huge challenge, which is, I think, the European community now is investing only in Greece $70 billion on improving the infrastructure, etc., but also the border security, because the movement of illegal immigrants, refugees coming to Europe.
So we have illegal immigrants, we have smugglers. What else do we have? What other risks across borders?
Terrorists, of course. Let's start with that. I think that's the number one threat that you have in borders. But you have to assume that, and once again, I keep thinking back towards the Egyptian border, which I've spent so many nights on, you have to assume that any potential, any smuggler is also a potential terrorist. Or any immigrant is a potential terrorist, which is why it's always a high-profile event which happens. And since the sand clock project, which was all the improvement of the border there happened, nobody's been crossing that border. But the smugglers have upgraded themselves as well. First of all, they're a lot better armed on the Egyptian side, and they will go to their cousins on the Israeli side, basically throw their bags over the border. They look like little dwarves on the thermal cameras, and they throw the bags over the border. And on the other side, they'll be waiting for them, and they'll be driving into the dunes with lightweight vehicles, which the military can't follow with its heavier vehicles. And it's always a big question, is this something that the military should be doing, or is this a question for the police? And then goes the political questions. What happens if we stop the smuggle trade in the south? Are they going to turn to start transferring weapons and terrorist activity? It's a big question.
It's a very good question, and I don't understand why I didn't spoke about it before. Because I must say that Prime Minister Sharon understood that point very, very well. And I'm not, I mean, we have the great military forces, and I'm not saying nothing against that. But those borders, especially the peace borders, are being held by reserve, most, and they're very small units. So let's take a case when somebody is smuggling, I don't know, hundreds of marijuana, okay, and it's real cases. So the military is holding them. So the guy which came to reserve for 2 weeks, he needs to fill a report, take it to the Dimona police station, which in a good shift there are 2.5 police officers, and if they are nice to him, they will get him in 5-6 hours.
It's an hour-and-a-half drive.
Exactly. And then he have to come 3 months after to the court to testify because he's holding so
I know where this is getting to. He's just going to smoke it and that's it, right?
That's it. So it won't happen. So he prefer to hold them, to take so when the police officers are coming there, the border guard police, now it changed because they put those units which Karakal and Arava, etc. But again, it's a police issue on those kind of borders. In Lebanon, Syria, it have to stay like...
I just want to answer what you said there, and it actually goes into something that Noam said before. Disruption is a method that's often used on that border because interception is a lot harder because, as I said, they're more agile and quicker than the forces there. And also, you can't shoot on Israeli citizens, and it's not wise to shoot on Egyptian citizens either. So one of the things that it always happens there, it's kind of a cat and a mouse game. The idea is, if we talked about the fact that the drone can't stop somebody from infiltrating the border, but it can try and send him through somewhere else. The moment he realizes that he's being watched, there's an entity there, he might disrupt his activity and buy another couple days till he tries it through another place. So that's where the technology, the surveillance comes in. The idea that we know what's there helps us make the decision about what to do.
Right. Gentlemen, I think we're running out of time.